Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our federal budget webinar. We'll wait a couple of minutes for everybody to join, and then we will get started. Okay, so welcome everybody to our Pocket Lobbyist Federal Government Budget 2024 Debrief. We're really excited to be with you today. As many of you know, this budget was a very important budget, and it is one that we're really excited to get talking about today. But before we do, I just want to provide a little bit of context about who Pocket Lobbyist is and what kinds of products we offer. So Pocket Lobbyist is a business that we started a few years ago now. It is a tool to empower people to anticipate, interpret, and mitigate political risk in Alberta and across Canada. We have a free newsletter, a paid membership, as well as cohort programs that we offer to learn how to do government relations and public policy work in Canada. So we encourage you to check us out at pocketlobbyist.com or reach out to us after this webinar if you'd like some more information. Today, we are going to talk about a few different aspects of the federal budget. We know that you've probably done a lot of reading in the news at this point. So the purpose of today's budget is not to give you all of the facts and figures inherent in the federal budget, but to dive deeper and go into some more analysis so that you have the tools that you need to understand and interpret political risk within your own business. And so we will do that over the next 20 to 30 minutes to keep it short. We know everyone's time is really valuable. Some things we think you should consider in the context of this budget. So generally speaking, when we are talking about federal budgets, we are looking at things that are under the federal responsibilities and jurisdiction. So in Canada, we have a federal system of government, which means that some things are in charge with the provinces, but some things are the federal government's responsibility. Now, the struggle oftentimes that federal governments face is that a lot of the things that are very important to individuals or of high concern when it comes to things like healthcare, education, and perhaps other issues are not technically in the federal government's control. And we'll talk a bit about some of the complexities of that with this budget as we dive into things. We also must consider when we're looking at budgets, the long run versus the short run. So a lot of the things that the federal government does have control over are things that will only be impacted in the long run. And so while there might be short run expediency required, the long run is really the sort of time horizon that we're looking at. And of course, as you're aware in politics, you don't always have the benefit of being able to depend on the long run, especially with a federal election coming up around the corner. We also want to note that in Canada, the Parliamentary Budget Officer does offer an independent analysis of the claims that are made in the budget. And so you should watch for that in the coming weeks and months as well, to just sort of see how the federal government's numbers line up to independent analysis, as well as many other organizations across Canada that offer such analysis. Now, the specific context of Budget 2024 today, we've had a federal Liberal government since 2015. We're in the third year of the minority mandate from 2021. This government's facing significantly lower polling numbers than I'm sure they would like. They have a confidence in supply agreement with the NDP federally, but there are several different factors, including the relative performance of the federal Conservative Party, the fact that affordability is a concern across the country, the geopolitical concerns across the country, as well as in the Middle East, as well as the American election coming up later this year. And they are racing against the clock to the next federal election scheduled for October 27th of 2025. That's if they are able to maintain their minority government. Until then, their confidence in supply agreement with the NDP shows no signs of being threatened, even though it is definitely within the NDP's best interest to suggest it could be so. Now, when we talk about this budget, fairness for every generation was the theme of the budget. It's no surprise this was the theme. You've heard the federal Liberals talk a lot about this, generational fairness. They ran on a platform of empowering the middle class. This has been something they've been very focused on. You'll see several different key themes, but I think one of the most visible themes in this budget is the investments that they've made in housing. And we'll talk a bit about those moving forward. But generally speaking, they made a huge fairness play to reach out to sort of millennials and Gen Z because of the affordability challenges and some of the issues that have not been resolved over the course of the Liberal government's time. So we'll get into some of this as well. Now, when we look at the numbers of budget 2024, I think it's really important to note some of the fiscal guardrails that Chrystia Freeland had talked about. Now, the federal Liberals have received a lot of criticism for their spending habits and spending too much money with respect to public services and the sort of influx of cash that they've put into the Canadian economy. But there are fiscal guardrails that the government created and imposed for themselves that they have maintained in this budget, though many would probably rightfully criticize that the fiscal position of Canada is not probably in the best position that it could be. And so you do see them mind the not increasing the deficit more than the 2023-24 number, even though that's quite high. You also see them make efforts to lower that debt to GDP ratio, which is a pretty important economic figure that economists will look at in terms of the relative health of the economy and whether your country can be carrying as much debt, as well as declining deficit to GDP ratio, which they do. So fiscal guardrails in place to try and make sure that the federal government does continue to mind the fiscal situation in the province or in the country. When we look at some of the top line numbers in terms of what they thought was going to happen in last budget, those top numbers, 23-24, into what they're projecting for this next fiscal year, we see that revenues are up. Important to note that a lot of the revenue increases have a lot to do with oil prices. So provinces and jurisdictions with oil reserves, taxes off of that have a big impact there, as well as increasing in operating expenses. You will see that the federal Liberals spent significant amount of money this budget. Many would say COVID level spending. You also see that the deficit is going down, though not by much, but some, but the federal debt is going up and continues to go up. When you look at some of the economic assumptions that the government is projecting in this budget, you do see that inflation is going to continue to increase. It's at 2.9% right now. You see as well unemployment rate increases. We've got huge population growth happening in Canada, so this is a big factor as well. And then you also see that CPI number coming down slightly, but still quite high. When we look at revenue across all of the different areas that the government collects revenue, you can see we've broken it down into a chart there. You can see the largest source of revenue is income taxes, so both from a corporate and personal perspective, and we'll talk a bit about how those changes to the capital gains inclusion rate this budget are going to affect revenues in a pretty significant way, as well as, GDP taxes and other taxes that have an impact in what the revenue that the government can bring in, but they're working with relatively, $465 billion in revenues, which they can spend on programs and investments. When we look at tax changes, there were a lot of assumptions on what kinds of tax changes would be included in this budget, but the big one that we actually did see included was the change to the capital gains inclusion rate, which we're going to talk about a bit more later on in this presentation, which will have pretty significant impacts for investment and individuals as well who have any sort of investment properties or stocks or anything like that they might make money off of. Population growth is a very important metric in this budget. Canada is a growing country, and with growing countries and more people comes different needs for social services, housing, which is a huge challenge right now. So you can see that we increased by just over 1.2 million in 2023, projecting almost 41 million people by 2026. So Canada is growing, and it remains to be seen whether that growth is going to create additional challenges for the government, both federally, provincially, and municipally, or if that growth is going to be a net benefit, given we do have a relatively stable economy that needs jobs and people to work in them. When we look at expenses, this is what the government has spent money on this budget. So you'll see that program expenses make up a large portion of it, but a growing portion of the amount of money that this government is spending is on debt servicing. And we'll talk a bit about how much that is a bit later in the presentation, but it's a significant and not negligible amount of money that the government is spending, as well as you see there's significant transfers to provinces, territories, and municipalities as well. If you'd like to sort of look at how spending and expenses have changed over the past little bit, this chart shows expenses dating back to 2008. So you do see around that 2019, 2020, 2021 era with COVID, those expenses go up, and you'll see that the expenses do continue to go up into this time period as well. We look at some of the things, we talked earlier about in this presentation about what is actually the responsibility of the federal government and what's the responsibility of the provinces. Canada has a federal model of government, and the federal government does provide some transfers to provinces from the principle of ensuring that if you live in Ontario or Prince Edward Island or British Columbia, you're going to have access to relatively similar levels of social services. And that is something that MPs vote on the formula for, but it is an important principle of our Canadian democracy and federation. Now you can see that Canada Health transfers about $56.4 billion this year, along with equalization, a little less than half of that, as well as carbon tax rebates that are given back to individuals across the province as well. But you can see a total of about $105 billion, so about 1/5, roughly, a little less, of the total budget is going to provinces in the form of transfers. Now, when you look at all the different types of transfers that the government offers over periods of time, you can see that the amount of transfers that the government does provide has been going up. And you see, some of these things are formulas like equalization, but some of these things are also more at the federal government's discretion, like health transfers and other transfers as well. When you look at equalization across the country, this is a big deal if you're living in Alberta or Saskatchewan, or increasingly several other provinces as well, where this concept of a fair deal and what's the federal government giving us for the money that we our citizens are paying to their federal coffers. So you can see that Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia do not receive equalization payments. This has to do with fiscal capacity. So different things like relative wealth of the population in terms of how much they pay in taxes, as well as resource revenues and other aspects. And so you can see several other provinces are receiving equalization payments, and those total payments are about $25.3 billion out of the federal budget. Now, before we get into talking about specific program spend, I want to spend a couple of moments talking about economic growth. Now, economic growth is highly related to obviously our GDP and productivity, and this is a growing concern that a lot of individuals are pointing to and concerned by. So budget 2024 forecasts growth of less than 1% in real GDP nationwide, which is a bit less than the average for OECD countries, and certainly less than a lot of countries that are in more high performing situation. Of course, there's lots of discussion right now about whether we're going to go into a recession, just the post-COVID era, geopolitical tensions and concerns that are affecting that. The important thing to note for here in Canada is that lag in growth and productivity, even though you could say it is relatively stable, it's important to look at what the sources of that growth are as well. Now, there's a lot of data that's come out that suggested that the majority of the growth that we're seeing in Canada is largely through those public sector employee jobs, as well as increases in housing. We have a housing supply issue in this country, and the fact that there is not enough supply has been pushing houses up, which does play into that GDP number. So even looking at the top line numbers for economic growth in Canada and elsewhere is often not enough to tell the whole story. This gives you a little bit of a sense of how other province or other jurisdictions are doing. So you can see that, European Union, UK, America are doing much better than Canada and the European Union. But you can see it's not as though global growth right now is incredibly high. So it's a challenge that's happening across market economies, but Canada is not doing well relative to other countries in terms of growth. When we look at the net debt to GDP ratio in Canada, this is another very important metric that I really want to draw your attention to. So this is some data from the Fraser Institute that just shows the relative sort of increases in public debt load that is happening in Canada as a percentage of GDP. Now, the reason why this is really important is because, sovereign nations, but especially provinces, don't have an infinite ability to carry debt before it starts to impact the province's ability to secure more debt, but also to meet their spending obligations from a public service perspective. So it's a thing that more and more people are becoming aware of, and it's something that the next government will have to address, whether that's a liberal government or a conservative government. But it is something that, we talk about the theme of generational fairness. The generational debt that is being left for millennials, Gen Zers is on the rise, and that will come due. And with interest rates not low like they used to be, the cost of carrying that becomes more and more expensive. And just to give you a sense, government is spending $53 billion more over the next 5 years. And in that, they're increasing their debt, and the carrying cost of that debt is about $54 billion next year, which is double what they're spending on health transfers, for example. So it's something to just be aware of, that the money that is in carrying costs is not going towards program spend. I also want to take a brief moment to just talk about the effects of this budget on monetary policy and vice versa. So while the government of Canada is in charge of fiscal policy, so how money is spent, the governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, who's pictured there, is in charge with his team at the Bank of Canada of monetary policy, which has to do with setting the overnight rate, which is essentially the cost of borrowing. Now, the reason why the interest rate has been higher, it's at 5% right now, than we've seen, is because we have an inflation problem in this country, where inflation has been very high, which means that the money supply is high and things are costing more, essentially. Now, Canada's inflation target's between 1% and 3%, and the CPI from March 2024 is at 2.9%. So it's at the high end of that midpoint. They want it to be more at 2% or less than that. We are going to have another rate announcement on June 5th, which may or may not be in direct response to this budget. It'll certainly be an impact. But one of the things to note is that when there is more money pumped into the economy, it does cause the Bank of Canada, among many other things, to consider whether or not government spending is combating the impact of higher rates on managing inflation. So if the Bank of Canada, for example, is trying to increase interest rates to control the money supply and decrease inflation, but the federal government is spending and adversely affecting that, it will continue to be difficult for them to lower rates in the future. Now, when we jump into the main issues, again, we're not going to cover in an exhaustive way every single thing in the budget, but here are some of the main issues that are included in Budget 2024 that we think are probably very valuable for you. So housing is by far, I think, one of the biggest issues that people are concerned by. You see that the government makes significant investments in both direct cash infusions to increase supply, but also in policy changes that will impact how people can access, so that demand side. So they are definitely changing things to increase supply for building codes, construction, etc. But they're also allowing Canadians to use more of their RRSPs to convert for their first-time home buying. They're also allowing Canadians to have 30-year mortgages. And so you do see them make some policy shifts to make housing more accessible for individuals. But again, this is a long-term issue. And the fact that there's not enough supply is not an easy fix. Home prices are higher, and there's a lot of people who have benefited from home prices that are already in the market, so it's complicated politically. You also see a higher cost of borrowing with those interest rates being high. It's harder for people to access capital. And of course, people just generally with inflationary pressures have less money to save for a down payment or pay for their bills. So the economics of housing is something that they've definitely tried to focus on here. I think it remains to be seen whether or not some of the things that they've invested in will help, especially since a lot of these investments over the next 5 years, and they're going to take time to show. When we talk about affordability, there really was not anything in this budget that would directly benefit affordability. There are definitely investments in the National School Food Program, which is a commitment the Liberals made years ago when they first came into government. That's a good thing for food security and affordability. And they've definitely made some investments in the Canada Disability Benefit, as well as trying to address things like junk fees, so different credit card NSF fees and cell phone fees, as well as those housing affordability measures. But there wasn't a golden solution to affordability in this budget. They realistically are probably not able to, with one brush policy, fix this issue. So this is something that I think will continue to be an issue for Canadians, and it will continue to haunt them in the polls as well, because people don't want the government they have when they can't afford their life most of the time. So this is a political issue as much as it is an economic issue for Canada. One really positive investment that they've made is the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, which is a really amazing investment, $5 billion to ensure that Indigenous communities can have participation in resource projects. This model was originally started in Alberta with the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation and is now being copied in several jurisdictions across Canada, including federally. So it's a very good investment that they've made, which I think will be welcome by a lot of Indigenous communities. Now, when we talk about defense, defense is often far removed from Canadians' sort of awareness because, we're not like the United States with the kind of military power or geopolitical power that they have. And so defense often falls by the wayside. But one of the things I think that's important to mention is a couple of things here. So there is a pretty sizable increase in defense spending, which is going to probably cover a lot of the F-35 fighter obligations that we have coming up in 2026. But we also see constantly talking about the NATO target of 2% of GDP for defense spending. And so Canada is bringing that number up, but we are still not at that target of 2% for defense spending. So still lagging in that area, but an increase nonetheless. When we talk about energy and environment, we had more details that came out in this budget about the clean electricity investment tax credit, which contributes to the federal government's goal of that net zero electricity grid by 2030, which of course is not welcomed by all provinces, including Alberta. But this is something that they've made an investment in and released more details on that's included in this budget. When we talk about healthcare, one of the main issues that's being discussed is the National Pharmacare Program, which they've allocated $1.5 billion over 5 years for. Again, health is a provincial jurisdiction issue, and so they are going to have to work with provinces on how to roll this out. And a lot of this money won't directly go to provinces because it will have strings attached to it. So the investments are generally good, but the rollout and implementation remains to be seen. Now, when we talk about investment and growth, saving the best for last, or the worst for last, I suppose, best topic, perhaps one of the most concerning areas in this budget. Productivity is a huge challenge for Canada at this point. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the GDP growth that we notice, if at all, in Canada is from public sector job growth, from housing prices, not including, the kinds of productivity and innovation that you might want to see in terms of more jobs, more investments, more innovation. So this is an area that I think is lacking. And they did include some relief, I suppose, for small businesses. They have allocated $2.5 billion for the small business carbon tax rebate that's been promised over the past several years, but they made a very, very significant policy change in increasing the capital gains inclusion rate that is going to have likely a pretty significant impact on business. And so we'll spend a couple of minutes talking about that here. So essentially, the capital gains inclusion rate is the rate at which capital gains are taxed. And capital gains are profits from investments. And these apply to both individuals as well as corporations. So they are increasing the amount that they are taxing your profit from investments, whether you're an individual or a corporation or small business. Now, the rate before budget was 1/2, and they're increasing it to 2/3, and that comes into effect in June 2024, so just in a few weeks here. There is one thing to note, that there is a personal exemption up to $250,000, but there is no exemption for businesses. So they have essentially increased the rate of tax for profit. The reason why this is going to have, or could have an impact rather, on business is that for, let's say, venture capital investors or people who have a second home, perhaps it's a generational home that you've had in your family. If you sell that home and make a profit of more than $250,000, or if you are a business and sell your business and it ends up being a significant amount of money, you're paying more tax on that. And the reason why this is significant is because this is going to draw in about $20 billion to the federal government over the next 5 years. So between 4 and 5 billion a year. That is a significant amount of money from a tax change that is going to have the benefit of seeming like it is just making people who make more money pay more, which of course it could have that impact and likely will have that impact in many cases. But it does impact people who have or have worked hard to have their own assets as well. And sort of, the criticism of this would be that it disincentivizes investment. There's a lot of economists that have come out and suggested that the fact that this rate was so out of whack from, for example, the dividend tax rate is actually a good thing, but they did not supplement this with other tax cuts. So it alone and by itself is not necessarily a net positive policy, but it will have significant political impacts for them because they are trying to position themselves as juxtaposed against the conservatives of caring about the middle class. And they can message that very well with this change. And you've seen that they have, and they will continue to. So it remains to be seen how investors will respond. Perhaps there will be some benefit in that it will collect more money. But again, the collection of that money being projected on current economic activity and investments. So if people stop investing, then it won't have that kind of impact. So it's just something to think about. Now, we have a couple minutes left. I want to get into some of the implications of budget. So you see the Liberals try to, in this budget, strategically get themselves out of the polling realities that they have been facing for months now. The reality of the situation is that the Conservatives are leading them by a lot, and they have an election coming up in the next several months, as late as next October, but could be earlier because it's a minority situation. So you see them try to figure out a way to respond to those issues that Canadians say they're caring about: affordability, cost of living, housing. So they're saying a lot about the things that they know people care about. But again, how this unfolds and whether or not this benefits individuals in a timely fashion, it's remained to be seen. You also see significantly in this budget some language that's very much us versus them. So this generational fairness and use of the term activist government, you absolutely see them try to point the fingers at either Canadians who they perceive as being wealthy, at the federal Conservatives, at people who may or may not have the same sort of values that they have. It's interesting in the context of the fact that we have a federal election coming up, or presidential election rather, coming up in the States. There's a lot of obviously cultural overlap that happens between Canada and the United States. And with Donald Trump poised to perhaps do very well in the next election in America, perhaps become a president again, you do see the tides of the electorate shifting with these affordability concerns and the possibility of a recession. And so you do see the Liberals in this budget try to point fingers in and position themselves in such a way where they're saying, we're looking out for you. Who knows what these other folks might be doing? So you definitely see that because they need to have an enemy that is not themselves, because it is quite clear that the fiscal situation is not desirable, to say the least. You also see them try to intervene and announce investments in areas that are not their jurisdiction. So healthcare, housing, it's arguable whether housing is their jurisdiction, healthcare, education, all of these different areas that are not technically their responsibility constitutionally, but it allows them to make those investments and say they're doing something about areas that people genuinely care about. But the issue is that they can't unilaterally go into provinces and have exactly the programs they want. They have to work with the provinces. And you see in Alberta with Bill 18, that might be more difficult. So whether or not that federal funding actually flows down to people from a jurisdictional perspective remains to be seen. We also see timing again, whether or not these investments that they've made will actually work in time for the next election remains to be seen. And they don't have all the time in the world. And they continue each month to not be able to compete with the federal Conservatives in a way that they need to remain competitive. So again, you see that they are racing against the clock with some of what's happening here. So in terms of next steps, budgets are a matter of confidence, but not really, because the NDP is not going to not support the Liberals on this budget. The NDP, the only political party in this country that's probably doing worse than the Liberals right now is the NDP, relatively speaking. And so while Jagmeet Singh does what he needs to as the leader of the NDP and per the confidence and supply agreement, it's not actually going to impact the confidence of the House. So we're not going to see the government dissolve after this budget. We are, though, going to see budget 2025 start now. So if you are a stakeholder that has asks, you need to make sure that you're figuring out exactly what you want for next year and start that now. Presentations for the Finance Committee will be this summer. Get all of your ducks in a row so that you can start asking. And then as well, beyond just budget 2025, look towards election 2025. So are you engaging with other political parties on your policy ideas? Are you paying attention to what's going on to see how you can manage political risk within your organization based on that? These are all very important things that you need to start doing now, even though a federal election is probably not less than 18 months away, but you never know. So I want to just thank everybody so much for attending this webinar today. And we will be emailing all of the people who signed up an exclusive discount to our membership. So 25% off either our monthly or annual memberships, which is a pretty significant cost savings for you, especially if you go with the annual membership. If you have any questions or want to get in touch with us at all, please follow us on social media or send us an email. We'd be happy to reach out. And if you are interested in any of our products, so our newsletter or our membership or our cohort, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much to you all for being here. And we hope that you found this session valuable and that you're able to anticipate, interpret, and mitigate political risk within your organization, having a bit more information on how it affects you. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.